Welcome to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. Of course, we are waiting for the verdict. The verdict is in the trial of Derek Chauvin, who, of course, was among the 4 police officers whose detainment of George Floyd resulted in his death. Derek Chauvin, of course, is the officer who had his knee on the back of George Floyd's neck. We do not know what the verdict is, but we do know that the jury was deliberating for 10 hours. 10 hours, it sounds long, but in historical context, not necessarily that long. We know that the O.J. Simpson verdict, that deliberation took just 4 hours. We are also waiting for President Biden to speak. We're hearing he will be giving remarks at the White House as soon as the verdict is in, but we're still waiting for it. So I want to bring in my colleague, Adam Taylor of Bloomberg Law. Adam, thank you so much for joining us. I have to say, when we heard that the verdict was in, there was this sense of relief, but also this sense of dread, not knowing what the verdict will be. Regardless of what you believe, certainly this is a historic moment. Folks have said the system is on trial, that America is on trial, and certainly humanity. It feels like something big is at stake. Adam, tell us what we do know in this moment.
Well, we know that Derek Chauvin's been charged with 2 counts of murder in the second degree, murder in the third degree, and 1 count of manslaughter in the death of George Floyd. And we're going to find out whether he'll be convicted or acquitted. The closing statements were yesterday. We were expecting, I think, a longer deliberation than this, but the jury has come back relatively quickly. And during the closing arguments, we heard a couple of special prosecutors lay out the case. Steve Schleicher delivered the closing arguments for the state, where he walked through the timeline of events, just like we've seen throughout the 3-week-long trial, starting with George Floyd's birth and life and ending with his death at 38th and Chicago. And then Eric Nelson, the defense attorney, got up and tried to sow doubt, essentially. He threw a lot of things at the wall to try to convince the jury that there's some reasonable doubt that Chauvin was the cause of death. He brought in his own medical expert during the trial that said that it wasn't asphyxia that killed George Floyd. It was a sudden cardiac arrhythmia that was related not just to the knee on his neck and back, but to health conditions and drug use, and even the car exhaust from the police vehicle that he was next to. He also sowed doubt about the use of force, whether it was unreasonable. We kind of saw the blue wall of silence crumble in this case. We saw Minneapolis Police Chief Medaria Arredondo come up and say that what Chauvin did was not their policy and not their training, and that it wasn't a reasonable use of force. We saw several other police officers, including Chauvin's direct supervisor, testify to similar effect, as well as outside use of force experts. But Eric Nelson, the defense attorney, had to try to counter that. He also went into a discussion of intent and how it breaks into the charges. So we saw all that, and then Jerry Blackwell, another prosecutor, special prosecutor working the case pro bono for the state, got up and kind of summed up the state's case in a rebuttal at the end. We'll see what the jury says, but right now it's all in their hands.
Thank you, Adam, for walking us through what has been such an emotional trial from coast to coast. We're getting headlines from the White House, President Biden saying he's praying for the right verdict. Watching coverage on the ground, hearing folks, seeing what they're saying on social media, there seems to be this great expectation that because the jury deliberated so quickly, that it only took 10 hours, that this will be a guilty verdict on all counts. But that is not necessarily true, is it?
No, that's right. You mentioned the O.J. Simpson trial earlier. He was acquitted after only 4 hours of deliberation there. We all have our assumptions about what it means, but it's difficult to say. It sounds like the judge is in the courtroom right now, actually.
Adam, we are actually in the courtroom right now. We're going to take a listen in.
All rise for the jury. All right, please be seated. Members of the jury, I understand you have a verdict. Members of the jury, I will now read the verdicts as they will appear in the permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, Defendant. Verdict, Count 1. Court File Number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by jury foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you individually if these are your true and correct verdicts. Please respond yes or no. Juror number 2, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 9, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 19, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 27, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 44, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 52, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 55, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 79, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 85, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 89, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 91, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 92, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Are these your verdicts, so say you one, so say you all?
Yes.
Members of the jury, I find that the verdicts as read reflect the will of the jury and will be filed accordingly. I have to thank you on behalf of the people of the state of Minnesota for not only jury service, but heavy-duty jury service. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to follow the deputy back into your usual room, and I will join you in a few minutes to answer questions and to advise you further. So, all rise for the jury. All right, be seated. With the guilty verdicts returned, we're going to have Blakely, you may file a written argument as to Blakely factors within 1 week. The court will issue findings on the Blakely factors, the factual findings, 1 week after that. We'll order a PSI immediately returnable in 4 weeks. And we will also have a briefing on, after you get the PSI, 6 weeks from now, and then 8 weeks from now, we will have sentencing. We'll get you the exact dates in a scheduling order. Is there a motion on behalf of the state?
Your Honor, the state would move to have the court revoke the defendant's bail and remand him into custody pending sentencing.
Bail is revoked, bond is discharged, and the defendant is remanded to the custody of the Hennepin County Sheriff. Anything further?
Oh, Your
All
Honor.
right. Thank you.
Former Minneapolis
adjourned.
police officer Derek Chauvin found guilty on all 3 counts. Guilty of second-degree murder, guilty of third-degree murder, guilty of manslaughter. On the right there, you saw Chauvin being walked out of the courtroom. On the left, you saw George Floyd's family celebrating, an emotional celebration. Folks and supporters on the streets breaking out into a very, even just watching it, my heart is pounding. I want to bring in my Bloomberg colleague, David Weston. David, you have covered many of these trials over your career, and many trials where the verdict was different. And I'm curious what you're feeling right now, what your reaction to this is.
Well, if the nation wanted a clear answer, they got a clear answer. The jury was not out very long at all, in my judgment, 24 hours, more or less. And as you said, Emily, it was guilty right across the board on all three charges. Sometimes juries, go in and they compromise and they trade off, and maybe we'll hold them guilty on some and acquit them on others. This jury seemed to be pretty emphatic in the result. So as I say, if we wanted a clear answer, we got a clear answer. And you heard the judge then said, okay, sentencing in 8 weeks. We have various factors that you'll introduce. There'll be a pre-sentence report being given, but he's moving right along.
We're waiting on President Biden to make a statement from the White House. He had said he would make some remarks after the verdict came in. Obviously, it has felt like not just a system on trial, but our country on trial. And that this is some, much broader statement about how America values Black lives. What do you expect to hear from the president? What do you think the president needs to say in this moment? Because obviously there are plenty of folks who this is the verdict that they wanted to see, and many folks who will think that this is unjust.
Yes, and this is a president who has a special bond with the Black community across the country. We talked with Jim Clyburn, the African-American congressman from South Carolina, earlier today on Balance of Power, and he talked about the president and the sort of commitment he's made to the Black community. The Black community now will be looking to him to deliver. I have to say, though, Emily, if we go back through the history, and unfortunately it's too long a history, of police officers accosting and killing Black male defendants, you have to look long and hard to find a lot of convictions. There are a lot of cases that did not lead to convictions. This one is pretty clear, so this is different. The question now is, where do we go from here? How do we stop having these happen all the time? And I think that's going to be part of the burden that President Biden has. What do we do now? This is one judgment. A lot of people will find this just. We heard President Biden earlier today saying that he thinks it's an overwhelming case after the jury was sequestered. He said, I think this is an overwhelming case. But the question is, okay, that's one case. How do we make sure there's not another George Floyd a week from now, a month from now, a year from now? That's a much bigger challenge.
Absolutely, certainly. I'm thinking back to Rodney King. I'm thinking back to O.J. Simpson, and that was only a 4-hour deliberation. I remember as a little girl, my mom pulling over to the side of the road as that verdict was read. Obviously, this is a different situation, but to your point, this isn't the end of something. This is the beginning, isn't it? This is at least a jury calling for change.
And the question is, where does that change come from? We have various states now really taking a look at changing their statutes in regulating police and having more community support. We have a federal statute that's been proposed in the Congress called the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. And will this add impetus to that, to have more federalization, actually, of what has been a state and local issue about how we control our police? I don't know the answer to that, but I do know, to come back to your point, a lot of the country is going to be looking to President Biden right now to see, where are you leading us? Because let's be frank, there are a lot of people also who feel we need our police. Our police are terribly important to us. We cannot throw our police under the bus, but we also can't have them do the sort of thing that happened in Minneapolis. It's not an easy situation at all. And the president has been very careful. You remember, he avoided the defund the police movement. He said, I'm not for defunding the police. He's got to really strike the right balance between making sure this doesn't happen again, at the same time, making sure that our police can do their jobs.
And, again, we are still standing by for President Biden to make his remarks. I want to bring back Adam Taylor, our Bloomberg Law colleague, who's been following every single twist and turn of this trial. Adam, talk to us about what happens next. What are the next legal steps to come? We saw Derek Chauvin walked out of the courtroom there. What's next for him?
Well, he's going to jail for the interim. His bail was revoked, and he is now in the custody of the Hennepin County Sheriff's Department. In 8 weeks, he will face sentencing. We heard Judge Cahill there talk about Blakely factors. The state will put a motion in the next week to essentially enhance Chauvin's sentence for being an aggravated violation of the law. So they're going to be looking to add years onto his jail sentence. And we'll hear Judge Cahill in 8 weeks decide what Chauvin's fate will be as far as how much time he will spend behind bars. Chauvin waived his right to let a jury decide that yesterday at the end of closing arguments. So it will be up to Judge Peter Cahill to make that decision.
All right, Adam Taylor, our colleague at Bloomberg Law, thank you so much for your expert analysis on all of this. I want to bring back David Weston. David, of course, we know that police departments across the country have been preparing for this moment, adding extra staff, plans for potential protests, potential strong shows of emotion in the community. I wonder, with this verdict, what happens? How does America react, David?
Well, we shall see soon, that's for sure, Emily. I mean, I'm really reluctant to make predictions of what happens, although I must say I would normally expect if the verdict had gone the other way, I think that all of those security forces would be on higher alert. I am hopeful that, in fact, this may quiet things down just a little bit, even though there's a lot of ramifications. I also must point out, I mean, there's going to be a sentencing, there may be aggravated circumstances. There also could be a motion to dismiss notwithstanding the verdict. That is done often in criminal cases. And there's the possibility of appeal. We heard the judge yesterday refer to Maxine Waters' remarks up in Minneapolis saying, you know what, that could be a basis for appeal. So I'm afraid this is not just over yet.
Absolutely. This is not the end. This is just the beginning. And here we are looking at folks on the streets of Minneapolis now knowing the answer of the jury. And of course, we're all wondering what is next. What's next for Derek Chauvin? What's next for the nation? And how does a country heal after this? That's another question, David. Of course, all of us at home in the middle of this pandemic, watching what happened to George Floyd, couldn't even leave our homes to talk about it. And it kicked off the reemergence of this Black Lives Matter movement across the country, where we heard from not just folks on the streets, but boardrooms, folks in the C-suite making statements, making promises, promising to do things differently. And I wonder how much this trial, this story in particular, will really change this nation in the context of what we've all been going through, especially in the last year in lockdown.
Well, we can certainly hope for change. As I say, in the past, we thought there'd be change. We didn't get it. Maybe this time we'll get it. I also have to say, Emily, in addition to what you just said, which is, of course, right, I think a lot of us have almost re-experienced the trauma in watching the video during the trial that got played again and again and again with Officer Chauvin really attacking George Floyd. And so I think it's renewed a lot of that trauma, renewed some of the outrage and sort of the disbelief. How could that be for 9.5 minutes that you can have your knee on someone's neck? It's just sort of, you can't quite imagine what it is. Again, though, I want to say we have to bear in mind the vast majority of police officers in this country are good people who are trying to keep us safe. And somehow we have to achieve both. But to your point, Emily, this president, Joe Biden, is by his nature, by his background, by his experience, in a position perhaps to address that issue. And certainly he has put himself forward as that sort of person. As you know, he talked with the Floyd family earlier today, actually, just about how they were doing. So he's going to try to reach out and try to mend some of that. Also reform, as I say, there may have to be legislation. At the same time, preserving all the great things that we get from our police forces all around the country.
David, thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of that additional context. David Weston, my colleague and host of Balance of Power. I want to take you now to the streets of Minneapolis, where Fola Kinabe is standing by. She has been there throughout the trial, following also every twist and turn, following the reaction, seeing the crowds erupt. Fola, give us the view from the street where you are.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm here in George Floyd Square, outside of the Cup Foods where he was killed. And as soon as the verdict came in, there's a celebratory mood right now. People are chanting, people are clapping, people are hugging each other, people are crying, and there's a lot of joy here. I spoke to someone on the ground, and he said he's just trying to enjoy today and take this in. And then when tomorrow comes, he said he'll think about tomorrow. And so there's not really much of a police presence here, but a party-like atmosphere here in George Floyd Square.
What are folks on the ground saying to you? What have you been hearing from them over the last several days?
Well, there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear and concern, especially given the. I mean, you guys have seen images of the military presence, the barbed wire, the big trucks, the heavy police presence, and so there's a lot of fear about what was going to happen, and in fact, what was happening as this unfolded and as we waited for a verdict. I spoke to a business owner earlier today, and she runs a cleaning business, and she talked about how she feared for her staff. She had 60 staff, and they had to go out at night during curfew, and she was worried about them running into the National Guard, and they were worried about running into the National Guard. And so again, a lot of fear and confusion in the lead up to this, and a city that was really on edge.
Fola, does it feel like the city is still on edge right now? Now that the air is out of the balloon, now that we know what the verdict is, does it feel like that feeling of fear has dissipated, or is it still there?
Well, at least here in this few block range of George Floyd Square right now, it seems to have really dissipated. You could feel the tension leave when the verdict came down, and people seem happy now. So there's a celebratory mood here, and outside of the cup of foods here in George Floyd Square, people are hugging each other, people are chanting, people are clapping, and people really do seem happy.
All right, Fola Akinibi on the ground for us in Minneapolis. Thank you so much. We're going to check in with you again in a moment. But I do want to bring in Andre Swanston, the founder and CEO of True Optic, who is a guest on Bloomberg television often. And Andre, after what happened to George Floyd, you were very public, very open about sharing your own experiences as a Black man, your own experiences with police. They were not happy experiences. And I know that you've been watching this trial so closely, like so much of America. What is your reaction to these 3 guilty verdicts, guilty on all counts?
I think in some respects, there's definitely a sense of relief. At the same time, and I think one of the previous guests on your show mentioned this, the fact that there were so many communities across this country preparing for potential protests or riots because in the event of a potential not guilty verdict, I think just speaks to kind of the history of this happening. Yes, we had videotape of the murder happening, but we've had many instances in the past that I'm old enough to remember, from Rodney King to Eric Gardner of others, of assault or crimes committed by police on video where for some reason, there still was a not guilty verdict. So I do think that's still something that needs to be addressed moving forward. And unfortunately, as even though there's a sense of relief, I think, in the back of my head, I wonder, how long is it going to take until, there's another instance? Is it 2 months, 2 weeks, 2 days? Is it tonight? Because it is something that is quite systematic or quite more often in our society than it ever should be.
Well, and clearly this isn't the end of anything. This is a beginning, and I wonder what it means to you in terms of some sort of call to action. Of course, we know that there are so many incredible police officers who are working so hard to do their jobs, to protect this country. And obviously there are situations like this where things go wrong. But the real question is, does America value Black lives? And how do we value Black lives? And, what would you like to see happen in this moment going forward?
Yeah, well, I think that's the interesting question that you asked. Does America value Black lives? And I think it's certain people in America do, and some people still don't. We have, public officials that won't even say the phrase Black Lives Matter, because for some reason that is, crossing some sort of red line for them. We have pundits and officials and others that talk far more often about, property loss and property damage than they do the loss of life. So I do think that is an issue, and it's not just Black lives; it's Asian lives, it's Latino lives, it's transgender lives, it's a lot of marginalized minorities in this country that I think have to fight even to be accepted as mattering or having significance. And I think that's often why we have these issues. You know, somebody, a police officer or any person, to have your knee on another human being for 9 minutes plus shows a complete disregard or caring for the value of their life. And so I think it's something that we have to work towards. Training doesn't give somebody empathy or make them recognize a human being. So I think it starts far earlier than that.
Andre Swanston, CEO and founder of True Optic, I'd love you to stay with us so we can chat with you a little more after this break. And I do want to remind our viewers that the jury has returned its verdict, guilty on all counts. Derek Chauvin, the man who had his knee on the back of George Floyd's neck on that fateful day, May 25th, 2020, found guilty on all counts. You are looking at live pictures of the streets of Minneapolis at this moment. We're going to be talking about this throughout the hour. I'm Emily Chang. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. We are covering the verdict in the trial of Derek Chauvin, found guilty on all 3 counts: second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and manslaughter. You're looking at live pictures there of the streets of Minneapolis, obviously a trial that has gripped the nation and in particular this very city. I want to bring in our Mario Parker, who covers the White House. President Biden, Mario, was supposed to, as we understood it, be giving some remarks after the verdict came in, but now it appears he will not be delivering those remarks. Do we know what the president's plans are?
We don't just yet, Emily. What we know is that the White House signaled earlier, Jen Psaki, the press secretary, that the situation would be fluid as to the White House's response. As of right now, the White House hasn't called a lid, which means that we won't hear. We wouldn't. A lid would mean that we wouldn't hear from the president. It has not called that just yet, so it's still kind of up in the air as to whether or not the president we hear from him tonight.
Now, he did make a statement earlier saying that he was praying for the right verdict. And either way, what has happened over the course of the last year reveals a giant division in our country. And he will be facing a big task, how to unite this country. And of course, we know there are many wonderful police officers working hard to do their jobs. Talk to us about the task ahead for the president now in the aftermath here.
Right. As you mentioned, I mean, this has been going on for the better part of the past year. Then candidate Biden campaigned on healing a divided nation, bringing his personal experiences to bore as well. And so he's been saying that this is the moment that essentially that he wanted to, that he thought that he would be the right person for the job in order to bridge the divisions in the country. Now, that's a challenge, as you mentioned. I mean, there are people that love police. There are people that criticize the president for saying that he's anti-police. He's tried to say that that's a mischaracterization, that what he's looking for is to have better community policing and better relations between police and communities of color. But again, it's going to be a tough slog for him here to unite the country here.
Well, and let's talk about the legislation. Obviously, we know that George Floyd's brother was testifying before Congress, that there has been much activity and agitation for a change to law. Do you expect that this will add momentum to those efforts in a system that is always so slow to react?
No, I mean, we're kind of seeing some of the gridlock in Washington in general. this is an issue that is a lightning rod in any instance, right? So we saw, I mean, some deadlock on COVID. We're seeing some deadlock in rhetoric over voting rights. So in terms of getting something done legislatively on this issue, I mean, that's going to be really, really tough. The White House is saying that they're in negotiations, that they're in constant communications with Capitol Hill in order to pass the George Floyd Policing Act, which would address some of these kind of systemic issues in policing that the president has highlighted, that members of his base have highlighted as well. But again, whether or not he could get it across the finish line in a hyper-partisan Washington, D.C. is something to be seen still.
All right, Mario Parker, keeping an eye on the White House and President Biden for us. Thanks so much, Mario, for your thoughts. I want to get to, of course, I'm looking at my Twitter feed right now, thoughts about this verdict pouring out on social media. And we know that this is where and how so many people now express their emotions and will be expressing their emotions about this verdict. I want to bring in our Kurt Wagner, who covers social media for us. And interestingly, Kurt, especially in the case of Facebook, I understand that they had been making some preparations to moderate content around this verdict. In particular, what can you tell us about how the platforms have been preparing and if they have been preparing enough for this moment?
Yeah, Facebook was a little bit more proactive than I think we've seen historically. You'll remember last summer when there were a bunch of protests that turned violent. There were riots, and Facebook was pretty reactionary to a lot of that. In this case, they came out yesterday with a blog post kind of announcing, hey, here are the things we're going to do. We're going to take down groups and pages that violate the policies. They're going to kind of proactively hunt for hate speech, bullying, and things like that. One thing I thought was interesting, they considered Derek Chauvin a public figure, basically meaning that they were going to leave up more stuff that was critical of him because they don't necessarily protect public figures in the same way they do private ones. But I think the point being here is that Facebook kind of learned from a lot of the civil unrest we saw last summer and tried to get ahead of this a little bit more than we've seen historically.
So, it's just hard to know how folks are going to express their emotions, but what are you expecting in the next minutes and hours as this continues to unfold? I mean, we know that police departments across the country had been bracing for reaction. You wonder if, now that we know the verdict, if that same reaction that they might have been anticipating will happen.
Yeah, it's tough to say because I think we've seen both instances. We've seen people who have been very frustrated with the police. They haven't gotten these types of verdicts, this type of justice that they feel they deserve in the past, and that has been violent. On the other hand, you'll remember in Wisconsin last year, there were protests around a police shooting, and that got violent kind of in the other direction, right? There were people who were supporting the police who were there with guns, and so that got aggressive. And so it's a little too soon for me to tell. I'm obviously not there in person, so I don't know the mood other than watching what you're seeing on TV. But my feeling is that oftentimes this stuff takes a little while to kind of boil up. And unfortunately, social networks like Facebook and Twitter are oftentimes used to rally people around a certain message. So we're going to have to pay pretty close attention to see what people are saying on these platforms in the next few hours.
All right, Kurt Wagner, who covers social media for us. Kurt, thanks so much for bringing us that view. I want to bring back Andre Swanston, the CEO and founder of True Optic, who has joined us so many times on the show, joined us earlier to share his reaction, and has also shared his own experiences with police as a black man in America. Andre, we were talking with Kurt about the reaction on social media. We have seen so many outpourings through, not just this verdict and this trial, but through the Black Lives Matter movement. And I wonder how the power of that strikes you, for better and for worse.
Look, I think whenever there's a medium or an avenue for people to express themselves, generally speaking, it's positive. Obviously, that can be used to propagate negative sentiment or mistruths or other things that can end up being negative. But generally speaking, I believe that's always a positive. One of the things that you see online, but also in the media, is I think somewhat of a false narrative where people talk about the Black Lives Matter movement being anti-police, and I just think that should be corrected. When you murder somebody and pretty much strangle them to death while handcuffed on the floor, you're not a police officer, you're a murderer. And yes, so the people that actually serve and protect their communities, I think, should be admired and respected. But I think at the same time, the people that misuse their power should be held accountable. And so to me, there really isn't a Black Lives Matter versus police. There is, civility, and there's a citizenship and humanity versus the people that disrespect that. And I just think that should be clarified, as we move forward.
Now, Andre, when we last spoke about this, I remember you saying you were preparing to have the same talk with your own child about how to deal with police as a Black man in America. And I wondered, are you still preparing for that? Does this verdict change anything for you, how you imagine you and your son will be living your life?
No, I don't believe that it's going to change. One guilty verdict is not going to change the necessity for me to have certain conversations with my son and my daughter at the right time. I think there has been, an acceleration in certain conversations in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, in terms of George Floyd, and dealing with things during the pandemic. But that does not change. In no way does this guilty verdict negate the need to have additional conversations as we move forward, particularly when it, as they get older into their teenage years and would have more instances to be alone and out by themselves or driving. So, and that's unfortunate, but that's just, I think, the reality, not just for me, but for tens of millions of other people in this country.
You are in the business of streaming, and how we tell these stories, how the media tell these stories, how the entertainment industry, how Netflix tells these stories is so important to how a nation can change, right? And I wonder if you think Hollywood is doing enough. Are the entertainment companies doing enough? Is Netflix doing enough to make sure that representation is fair and representative, in fact, in telling the right stories?
I would say there's definitely been improvement in a positive direction over the last couple of years in particular, in terms of more diversity and inclusion in Hollywood, not only from the standpoint of the actors and the stories, but I think equally, or even more importantly, in the directors and the executives, as well as marketing and even things that, how data is leveraged to better understand audiences or reach them. And so it doesn't mean that there's not room for improvement and things that will continue on. But there definitely has been, I think, at least a concerted effort to do so, in particular the last couple of years.
All right, Andre, thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us. Andre Swanston, CEO and founder of True Optic. Really appreciate you being with us today. Again, a jury has returned its verdict and found Derek Chauvin, the officer whose knee was on the neck of George Floyd on that fateful day, guilty on all 3 counts. We are continuing to cover the fallout of this, talking about what happens next, what is next for police officers across the country. We're going to head now to a press conference happening in Minnesota. The Attorney General, Keith Ellison, standing by there. We can take a listen in to what the Minnesota Attorney General is saying. I believe
for giving us the time
there he is. Let's listen in.
To prosecute this case. They have shown the world what grace and class and courage really look like. Although a verdict alone cannot end their pain, I hope it's another step on the long path toward healing for them. There's no replacing your beloved Perry, or Floyd, as his friends called him, but he is the one who sparked a worldwide movement, and that's important. We owe our thanks to the men and women of the jury who gave many hours of their time and attention to carefully listening to the evidence, weighing the facts, rendering a verdict. They are regular people from all walks of life, a lot like that bouquet of humanity on that corner on May 25th and in that courtroom. They answered the call, and they served in a landmark trial. They now deserve to return to their lives. If they ask you to respect their privacy, we ask you to honor that request. I want to acknowledge the remarkable team that helped us prosecute the case. We put everything we had into this prosecution. We presented the best case that we could, and the jury heard us, and we're grateful for that. We had the sole burden of proof in the case, and history shows that winning cases like these can be difficult. I'm proud of every hour, every minute, and every ounce of effort we put in this case. And let me tell you, we spent many hours working on this case, did we not? We, week after week, committee meeting after committee meeting, this team never let up and it never quit. We fought every day, and we did it together. The Attorney General's office together with the Hennepin County Attorney's office. Thank you, sir. And we did it together. I'm deeply grateful to everyone who worked on the case. Most of these folks will tell you it's a bad idea to put together a team of all Michael Jordans. Nobody would want to pass the ball. This team, that was their true strength, is sharing the load, passing the ball, understanding that all of us together are smarter than any one of us alone. And that worked. Although the verdict has been rendered, this is not the end. In the coming weeks, the court will determine sentencing, and later this summer, we expect to present another case. We will not be talking about that. This verdict reminds us how hard it is to make enduring change. And I just want to finish by sharing some important historical legacy, if you allow me. In 1968, the Kerner Commission was formed to investigate the causes of uprisings across major American cities. And a man named Dr. Kenneth Clark, a famous African-American psychologist who, along with his equally accomplished psychologist wife, Mamie, contributed to compelling research in the Brown versus Board of Education case. And Dr. Clark testified at the Kerner Commission. And I want to quote you what he said. I read that report, the one in the 1919 riot in Chicago, and it was as if I were reading the report of investigating the committee of the Harlem riot in 1935, the report on investigating the Harlem riot in 1943, and the report of the McCone Commission on the Watts riot. I must say again in candor to you, the members of this commission, it's like a kind of an Alice in Wonderland with the same moving picture reshown over and over again, the same analysis, the same recommendation, and the same inaction. Those are the words of Dr. Clark in 1968. Here we are in 1920, excuse me.
You're listening to the Attorney General of Minnesota there sharing his reaction to the verdict in the trial of Derek Chauvin. You can tune into the terminal on Live Go if you want to continue listening to his remarks. But joining us now, Jason Johnson, the president of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. He's also the former deputy commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department. Jason, I know that you've been following this trial very closely, and of course, as a former law enforcement officer, what is your reaction to the verdict today? What are you feeling?
Well, I'm not surprised. I would say that before the trial began, I had some questions as to whether the prosecution would be able to effectively prove causation. I know there were others that had the same questions. But monitoring the trial, I think the prosecution did a very good job at laying out a very organized case that I think proved beyond a reasonable doubt causation, which was the issue that I had concern about. I do think that the video in this case was extraordinarily compelling. I know it was compelling for those who saw it on TV, and I'm sure it was compelling for jurors and weighed heavily in their decision-making process.
Well, and of course, George Floyd's brother made the case that no trial was necessary. The video told it all. I wonder about the role of police in the age of Black Lives Matter. In your view, how does policing need to change?
Well, I think policing should always change and evolve. And it is changing and evolving. I would point out that uses of force by police officers are rare. 99.9% of police encounters do not involve any use of force. 95% of police officers will go their entire career without discharging a firearm, and discharges of firearms over the last 50 years have decreased by 90%. So I think we're definitely headed in the right direction. I think we need to continue to improve our training, our recruitment and selection, improve our leadership capacities, our involvement in the communities. And I think all those things will take us to the right place. I don't think this one case is going to resolve the tension between police and many of the communities they serve, but I do think we're on the right path. And sometimes I question some of the skepticism around police today, because I think objectively police do a very difficult job, most often, vast majority of the cases, extremely well and professionally.
So how do you imagine that police across the country will react to this verdict, given what you just said there?
Yeah, this verdict will not come as a surprise to most law enforcement officers. I think many, if not most, law enforcement officers watched the video and were troubled by what they saw in the video. But officers also understand that everyone's entitled to due process. So I think the idea that Derek Chauvin, that there didn't need to be a trial just because there was a compelling video, is misplaced. I think we need to understand that a video is a piece of evidence. It can be compelling, but all police officers are entitled to due process. I don't think there'll be any negative reaction by police officers. I think they understand this verdict. There certainly will be some that will question issues like causation. Was it adequately proven? But I think on balance, this is a case that everyone understands this verdict.
So do you expect that there will be, I know you say you believe that police departments should always be evolving. Do you expect that this case in particular will lead to a cultural shift in policing across the country?
Cultural shifts are very difficult in policing in particular, because the culture in policing is unique and it is relatively strong. Some agencies have done a fantastic job at improving the culture without diminishing the profession itself, and others struggle. And one of the police departments that I worked at struggled with culture and continues to struggle with culture. I don't think this one case is going to do it, but I think continued smart ideas about how to improve policing, how to improve the policies they work under, how to improve, again, I'll say recruitment and selection of police officers and of leaders in police agencies is critical, and improve the accountability process. That over time is going to fix any cultural issues that exist in policing, any negative cultural issues that exist in policing. I don't think this one case is going to have a strong impact there. But I do think this is a reminder for everyone, whether you're a police officer or not, that our judicial system does work. And in this case, there were people who doubted it and didn't think it would work and thought that there would be, I don't know, something would happen where a jury would be afraid to convict a police officer. And that just didn't happen. So due process works, our system works. And I think to the extent that we can limit it, political interference in our system, I think we'll be better for it.
It's wonderful to hear that sense of optimism. You know, we were just talking to Andre Swanston earlier, who believes that, you know, change will be difficult, change may not happen. And I'm curious, when you say, you know, whether there are cultural issues, what do you think, if there are, as you said, negative cultural issues inside police forces, what are those issues?
Well, I think there's a hesitancy. I mean, I'm not going to deny that there is a hesitancy among police officers to report the misconduct of other police officers. That hesitancy does still exist. I think it is being overcome within law enforcement culturally. There are programs that are spreading around the country how to train officers to deal with those situations, how to intervene if they see another officer for any reason using what they think is excessive force, how they can prevent that force from continuing. And they're training you. Maybe you don't think that officers need to be trained how to do that, but they do have to be trained how to do that. There's a particular way to do it, and officers are being trained around the country how to do it. And I think that's a great thing. Most major police agencies are implementing that. I think that's an example of very positive change that was instigated from within law enforcement. It wasn't imposed from any outside third party, wasn't imposed by a lawsuit or anything else. It's being done by police for police, because it helps police officers as much as the communities they serve, for officers to make sure that they always stay in contact with the policies and the training that guide their performance.
Now, we know that police forces across the country were preparing for this moment in case of unrest, in case of a very strong emotional reaction, people flooding out onto the streets. Do you imagine that will still happen now that we know what the verdict is? Tell us what's happening inside these police departments right now.
Well, I'm sure every agency is going to maintain whatever their plan was. We don't know what the reaction will be. I see that just from watching the coverage here that there is some celebration in various places across the country. I do expect that, and I expect that to continue. I know agencies are going to want to be careful because there's going to be more people out in the street than is normal. There's always the risk that something bad can happen. I don't necessarily anticipate that, and I don't think they do either. But out of an abundance of caution, they'll maintain their current postures and just kind of wait and see what happens throughout the night.
What do you think is next, Jason, as somebody who's lived it on that side?
Well, I think probably the biggest exception that I find myself taking when I hear from perhaps people who are police misconduct activists is that I think each of these cases are unique and they stand kind of in their own, the evidence of the case speaks for itself. And it's not transferable to other cases. And I think that's the fundamental difference in between how I and other people who are from a pro-law enforcement perspective see things. I would look at any of these other high-profile cases, and I might have an entirely different analysis for the case because it's going to be based solely on the evidence of that case. So I'm not a person that thinks that police abuse and police misconduct is rampant. I do believe it exists. And I believe when it exists, it has to be rooted out and it has to be dealt with due process for all involved. But I think it does have to be eradicated, and we should continue to work toward that. But where I take exception is I don't believe that it's an epidemic. I don't believe there's an epidemic of racial profiling or injustice by police officers. I think a lot of the perceptions that exist, they're generational, and they have existed over a long period of time, and they've been handed down through generations who've taught the next generation about what to look out for with police officers. And they're also compelling because sometimes the cases, these high-profile cases, come at us over and over again through the media, through social media, and through video images. And so they're very gripping, they're very compelling, and I think they perhaps project something beyond what they should because they just are one case. So I think you asked me what is next, and I think what is next is that every police officer needs to look within him or herself and remember why they entered the profession, and continue to work toward the goal of professionalism, connecting with their communities, but also protecting their communities and not shying away from taking enforcement action when it's appropriate. And I think most officers will do that. There is a real concern out there, I have to tell you, that some of the unfair treatment of police officers, or what is perceived by police officers being unfair, leads them to be afraid to take action when necessary. And I think that's a real danger for public safety.
It's really important to hear that perspective, Jason. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Jason Johnson, president of the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund, thank you for joining us. Once again, the verdict has been reached in the trial of Derek Chauvin. I'm going to let you listen to it for yourself. Take a listen to the verdict being read.
We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April, 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror foreperson, juror number 19.
Derek Chauvin there, guilty on all 3 counts. And you are looking at live pictures of the streets of Minneapolis as the city digests this verdict. Stay with Bloomberg Television. We're going to be talking about this more over the next several hours. I'm Emily Chang. This is Bloomberg.